Right now in our Google Sheet, we have a handy dandy sidebar input sheet where we can put in an EV log into our sheet and it will return into the bottom here. Let me show you. So we've got EV001, we've got a distance of 35 kilometers and a charge used of 0.0189% of a charge, and we hit submit. And you can see it's been added into row 21. So one issue that we could face is what happens if a user enters in a value that's larger than the range of an EV vehicle. So for example, we might know that EV vehicles are incredibly efficient, and this may be a bit of wishful thinking, but perhaps they go a maximum of 950 kilometers. Now, if our user types in 1000, there's no means to stop them. Likewise, if a user puts in a charge greater than 1, which would be 100%, there's no way of stopping them either. So if we submit that now, we can see that these values have been put in. So now the user has driven 1000 kilometers on 200% charge, which we know is impossible. So there's two ways of resolving this. First way you might want to fix this is to fix up the HTML with some rules to prevent the user from exceeding certain limits. Now we will cover this in the next tutorial because it is a great way to help guide the users, but it is not 100% effective, and you should always do a series of data validation back in the back end of your code. And for us, the back end of our code is Google Apps Script. So let's dive in. First, I'm going to delete this unsightly value here. And if you're playing along, there's a link to the starter sheet in the description below. All you need to do is make a copy of it, open it up, and head over to extensions and app scripts, and you will get into a sheet like this with all the starter script ready to go. And what we're going to do here is add some extra functions on top of this script to make it run with our validation. Let's get cracking. So the first thing we want to do is head over to our Index.html page, and that's the one that's displaying our sidebar over here. And we're going to scroll down to the bottom. And right now, when we click our submit button, we use Google Script Run processForm, this parent node. And we're going to change that in a moment to a sendInput function and then deploy this Google Script Run from the sendInput function. So let's get into that. So just below the last div and above the body tags, let's type in script and close the tag. And let's hit enter. And inside a script, we're going to create the function sendInput. And this function is going to take an input as its parameter. All this function is going to do is to run the process form, but it's also going to do two other tasks as well. So let me explain as we type it in. So first we're going to type in our Google script dot run. Before we ask Google to run our process form, which is over in our GS code, which is here, we want to make sure it's successful. We want to do two things. The first one is, let's hit enter and create a new line and just tab over. And we're going to use the withSuccessHandler method. Okay, and let's head over to the documentation, our second home, and it says it sets a callback function to run if the server-side function returns successfully. So if we have a successful process without any errors, once we hit the process form and runs the append EV log function, and everything comes back without an error, the withSuccessHandler will run a function. So let's head back to our script and go to our index. So withSuccessHandler, and that function we're going to run is simply onSuccess. And we'll build that function in a moment. Now, also, we want to know, or we want the user to know, if there was an error with the code. Here we can use the withFailureHandler. And let's aptly name that onFailure. Cool. So withFailureHandler, just like the success handler, if there is an error in our GS code, it's going to run this withFailureHandler method and then call this onFailure function on our Index.html file. Okay, so the last one we need to do now is call our process form and run that inside our Code.gs file. So now we type in process form. And what are we going to send to our processForm function? Well, that is going to be our input. So now that we have that, we need to update this onClick. We can keep this parent node because that's going to get the data we need, but we're going to change the function call to be sendInput. So I'm going to double click that, hit Control C to copy, go up here, get rid of the Google script run.processForm and replace it with sendInput. Before we can test this, let's just build out our onSuccess and onFailure functions. So a couple of spaces, and let's type in function onSuccess. There it is there. And let's do the other function as well, function onFailure. Okay, and this is going to do a couple of things. So the first thing we're going to do, if we've got a success, if the script runs perfectly and all these values are entered into our row, then we want to clear the script just in case the user wants to add in another log. So we can use the JavaScript document method, and then we can get the get element by ID. The element we want is the input form ID, which is the form ID up here. So let's just double click that so we know we're not going to make a mistake and paste it in. And then we want to simply reset. And that will clear out all the values in the form. Nice. Let's put a little handy note up there for our future self. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is to return a success notice. Okay, here again we need to get an element by ID, so document. Get element by ID, and this element is going to be a new div, and we'll give that new div an ID result. So we've got our main container div, and just below our form, we'll give ourselves a couple of breaks. And just Shift Alt and down to make a second one, and then hit enter, and we will create a div with an ID equal to, and what was it? Result. And we'll just keep it empty because we don't want to see anything in there until we display a result. Cool. All right, so get element by ID result. Well, that's a new one we made. And what do we want to do? Let's get the inner HTML of that div and have that equal to, and we'll just use the templating backticks here, and we'll open up a paragraph element, and we'll give that a style equal to color blue, and close the paragraph. And this is a bit of foreshadowing. We'll talk about this in a moment. So we'll put in a result dot comment. Up here on our success function, we want to feed in the result object. And that part of that result object is going to have a result comment in there. Okay, so we've got that on our result. Let's give that a quick test. So we'll save that. We'll go back over to our Code.gs, and we've got our append EV log. So we don't want to actually append the EV log while we're testing. So we'll just type in return here temporarily. And let's just return an object that has a comment that says, hey ya. Let's head back over to our Google Sheet. Because we have edited the Google Sheet, we can't simply just hit submit. We have to go back and refresh the sidebar. And let's just add in our 35, add in this value here, keep our lives easy, and we'll hit submit. And you can see now we've got heya that's been produced down the bottom here. So it was successful, there was no errors in the code, so it spat back heya. Fantastic. So let's head back over to index page. Now we've got the basics of it, but we are also going to spit out two conditions. The first condition is if all the data is valid, we want to say something, and if it isn't valid, we wanted to say that they have made a mistake, there's an error, and tell them what the error is. So what we need to do is just underneath our onSuccess, let's create a if statement to handle this. So we can say if result dot is success, So this is going to be another property of the result object that we're going to add in, and it's going to say, is the data successful? True. Or are there errors in the data? It'll be false. Okay. And now let's go and grab all this here, and we can just hit Alt to move it up. There we go. Nice. So that's our truthy condition. And what happens if there is an error? Let's just use else here. So there was a validation error. What are we going to do? So we're going to use the same stuff here. So I'll just tab this over to make it look neat. So let's just collect this line and the top one as well. Hit Control C and just go underneath and hit Control V to make a copy. And we're not going to return a success notice here. We're going to return a failure notice. And let's style that to be red. So now if there's a mistake in the code, it's going to report red down below. Let's hit save. So we'll double click is success. Let's go back to our code. We'll hit a comma here and let's add this property is success, and we'll try and get a red one and we'll call this false. We'll hit save. Go back to our sheet, rebuild the sidebar and type in our data and hit submit. And because it was false, it was an error, it was a failure, so we've got the red font. Cool, that seems to be working well. So back to our Index.html, and we can build out our onFailure notice now. So this one's going to return an error if there is a failure in the code, not necessarily a failure of validation. So return error. Let's grab the same line again. Hit Control C. We'll go over and Control V. And then Shift tab to bring it back a few times. Cool. On failure notice, we want to report an error. So we'll say error. And we still want to get the element by ID. We want to put the error result in our result div. And we want to style that as red, so that's good. And instead of having a result.comment, we're going to use the inbuilt error handling, and we want to display the error.message to find out what the technical issue was. Okay, let's hit save. Go back to our Code.gs file here. And we're going to intentionally put in an error here. Just a bunch of weird values. All right, and let's grab the sidebar again. Punch in our 35 and hit submit. And now we've got a reference error. So it shows that we've made a mistake somewhere in our code, and the mistake is this value here. This object is not defined. Cool. So that's been handled well. We've tested it. We're good to go. That's everything in our Index.html we need to update. Let's head over to our code. Let's get rid of this error. And now we need to validate the input that's coming in. And we need to do this before we get to this append EV log. Okay, so let's delete that, return, and let's go up here. First thing we're going to do is validate our data, and we're going to make a variable, we'll say const, and validation result. And that's going to be equal to a function that we'll build in a moment called validateInput. And that will take our input from here. And we'll just make a note on what it returns. So we'll say it returns, and this is what we want it to return. Returns an object that contains two properties. First one is success, and that's going to return a boolean, true or false. And it will also return a comment. And we'll just make a note that it's going to be a result comment. And that comment will feed back into the Index.html. All right, once that's fed back, we need to decide whether or not we should go ahead and append the EV log. First, we can say, if this validation result isn't successful, then we just want to return the validation result back to the index page and display it down the bottom. So we've got validation result, and we can say is success, so that's going to say true, and let's make it not true, so we'll put an exclamation mark here for the shorthand for not true. So if the validation result is false, then all we want to do is return the validation result. and that will return back to our Index.html. It will be a success, so it will go to the onSuccess function, and then it will check if the result is a success. Well, it's not, so it will use the else condition and then punch this out with a color text with the result and a comment about why it failed. Okay, so that will return and complete the function. And however, if we are successful, we do want to run the append evlog function. And after we run that function, we want to return the validation result again. Sweet. All right, so that's our process form sorted out. Let's jump down underneath that function and build out this validate input. So I'll copy that, Control C, and just type in function, Control V. The first thing we need to do here is to ensure that our fleet is correct. So right now, the user has a drop-down menu, but a user could simply hit F12 and find this value here and alter it by hand, and then try and put in a value that would corrupt this sheet. So what we can do to validate this value here is compare it against our fleet list here. Okay, so we're going to make a constant variable called fleet, and that's going to be equal to spreadsheet app get active spreadsheet, and we're going to change a bunch of methods here. And the next method is going to be get range by name, and our fleet has a named range. So if I just click on this and go to data and named ranges, you can see that the list of fleet IDs has the fleet named range. So let's type in fleet, and that's going to select that range. And now we need to grab the values. And once we grab the values, that's going to give us a 2D array of fleet values. And let's flatten that to just a 1D array. So we've just got each of the EV values as an item of that array. And we can use the JavaScript flat method for this. So the last thing we want to do with our fleet is just to get rid of all the empty values in the list. So let's just use a quick filter method here. And that takes a function, and we'll use an arrow function, EV equals the little arrow, and if the EV of each value does not equal empty, then we want to keep it. Nice, so that's got our fleet list now. So now we can create our rule, and what's our rule for the fleet? If the input has a property called fleet, then we're good, we want to keep it. And if that value inside the input.fleet is contained somewhere within our fleet array, then it's all good. We want to keep it. If not, we want to report an error. So here we're just going to report an error. So we need to say, if not, as our first condition, input dot has own property, and that's fleet. So if the input we get doesn't have a property called fleet, we want to report an error. Alternatively, or if the fleet list has an index of, so it's going to find the index of our input.fleet that is equal to -1, so I can't find a value in our fleet array that matches, then we want to return, oh, hang on, I've got an error here, let's check it. We've got an extra brace, get rid of that. Oh, everything's happy again. Cool, and now we want to return our object. So that object is going to be is success, and we want to mark that as false because it didn't match. And then we want our comment to be failure fleet vehicle with this name not found. Cool. So our next two conditions that we need to check are numerical conditions. That's our distance and our charged use. Now, distance needs to go between 0 and 950, and our charge use needs to be a percentage, so between 0 and 1. So let's just build those out. So the first thing we need to do is create a function that checks a number is between two values. So we've got function. So we need to check first if the value is a num and it is between We're going to put in 3 parameters here. First is going to be the value that's there. Then we're going to have a minimum value that we're going to input and a max value. So if the value is between these 2 items and it's a number, it's good to go. First we need to check the length of the value. So if val.length, and that will check if someone put in any items into the value list. So if value.length is equal to 0, that means there's no input in there for that item. So we want to return false. Okay, so is number in between? Well, no, it's not a number because it's nothing. So we'll return false. So let's create another condition. And before we do that, we need to check that we have a number. So let's convert our value into a number first. So const num for number. And we can use the number constructor here. And inside that, we want to put our val. And if the number constructor can't make a number, it's going to return not a number. Now let's check if the val is a number. So we can say if is nan. If it's not a number, we can type in our num. Then we want to return false. So once we check that it is a number, we want to check if the number is between our min and max values. So we can say else if, and our conditions are the number is less than the min, then they've made a mistake. Or if the number is greater than the max, then they've inputted the wrong number as well. So we need to return false here as well. Otherwise, else, it is the correct number. True. Cool. So now that we have this function, we can use this to test our 2 numerical inputs. All right, so let's first check the distance. And we can use an if statement again. So if, and we're going to do the same thing here. So we need to check that the distance is a property of this input parameter. So input dot has own property, and this time it's going to be called distance. Okay, so that's distance here, and that is reflected so on the name of the item and the ID. So if there is no distance in there, we want to report false, or if it's not a number, we want to report false. So is, and we're going to call this function between, and that takes our value, which is going to be input dot distance, and then our minimum number is going to be 0, and our max number is going to be 950 kilometers. So again, we need to return the same thing we did up here, just with a couple of extra messages. So let's just copy that and paste it in. So is success false, because there's a mistake here. And just after this failure and colon, we need to say distance must be between 0 and 950 kilometers. Okay, and we need to do the same for the charge. So let's not reinvent the wheel, and let's just duplicate that. Hit Control C and Control V and change our distances to charge. And I've selected this distance here. Let's hit Control D, Control D, Control D, and type in charge to do them all at once. Oh, let's not put in a space though. And then change this to a capital. And so we've got our input has own property charge. I've got a space here I need to get rid of. If it doesn't have the property charge, or if it's not a number or between these values, we need to report an error. And this time our values are between 0.00, 0 and 1.00. Let's add in something a bit more descriptive, and we'll type in charge must be between 0 and 1 as a portion of 1. We'll put in a little percentage hint here as well. Hopefully that's not confusing. Sweet. And the last thing we need to do is just return any success condition. So if everything's been checked out and it's all hunky-dory, let's return a success. And then we'll grab this again. Control V and change our isSuccess to true. And change our failure to success. Okay, and then type in item added successfully. Stop. Let's give that a little test before we go ahead and run it in production. So we'll go function, test, and let's create an input object that has all these values. So the first one is fleet, and we'll put in EV001 as a correct item. We know that one's correct. We can say distance, 50 case, charge 0.02, which is 2% of the charge it's used. And let's just add that to our validate input. And hit save. And go up here and we'll just select our test item here. That's going to return a value, so let's just console log what it returns. And we'll hit run. Cool. So everything was successful because everything was correct. So is success. Nice. Let's make a mistake here. Let's make a value larger than our EV. So we'll say 7, for example, and see what happens. So as a failure, fleet vehicle with this name is not found. Got it. So let's take that back to 4. Let's put it in a value, a letter. So put in T here for our distance. Check that. So failure, distance must be between these two values. Let's put in a number that's larger, so we can say 1000 again. And check that. Success is false, and failure distance must be between those two values. Got it. Let's go back to something normal again. So we'll say our 50 case. And change our charge to, say, 2. And we've got a failure again explaining the error with the charge. And let's just make sure everything's working again. 0.02. Okay, so our test condition is met and our function is working successfully. Let's get rid of that test and hit save. And we're all done. So let's move over to our input sheet and just rebuild it again. Hit F12 for developer tools and select the select item button and then find the drop down list. And let's just find this item in here. And let's just change this to something bizarre like 10. And now we've got this EV item 10 in here. We'll type in our 35 and a normal number and we'll hit submit. And we've got a failure fleet vehicle with this name not found. Cool. Alright, our hacker skills have been thwarted. Hit submit now. Item successful. Great. What about if we put in an obnoxious number here? Change our fleet vehicle. Distance must be between 0 and 950. Cool. Let's change that to our 50. And check our use charge. Let's put in a 2 here. Hit submit. Charge must be between 0 and 1. Awesome. Let's put in a 0.02 and submit. Success. And we can now see that it's been added successfully into our input sheet. Cool. Okay, so we've successfully put in some server-side or Google Apps script-side data validation. In the next tutorial, we are going to go ahead and put in some more helper validation for our users. So the user can see while they're putting in the data in the sidebar where they're making mistakes, so they don't have to wait for this feedback here. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please click the like button. And if you want to find out when the next tutorial comes out, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Until next time.